Okay, it's time to talk about the most important aspect of government and of the United States government. So today we're going to talk about the Senate. And by design, the Senate is the most important and necessarily the most predominant governing institution we have in the United States. The Senate was designed for secrecy and dispatch, legislative checks and balances, continuity and stability of government, and separation of powers. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video, and hopefully I can keep it short because I want people to actually hear me. The Senate is a democracy. That's where our democracy is. All the states are assembled as equals with equal suffrage to reach a majority consensus of the states to make all the collective decisions of a free and independent state with the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, and to establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things that an independent state may by right do. And if you're wondering where I got that from, it comes straight out of the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence for why they declared their independence from the state of Great Britain and what they were gaining by that Declaration of Independence. And most people want to talk about self-government. No. At that time, yes, if you understand that the purpose of government is to make decisions for all those things that I previously stated, then yes, they wanted the freedom and the sovereignty to make those decisions themselves. And the way that it's stated in the Declaration of Independence is that all things independent states may do, okay? Because they were declaring their independence as individual states, because there was no union at that time. Were they Confederates? Yes, because they were states joined in a common cause against a common enemy. Okay? That made them Confederates. But when they declared their independence, they drafted that document and that was published to declare their independence in a general Congress. And what that means is that they just met as interested parties to discuss matters of a common interest. So when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they all had to unanimously agree to it for them to be a party to it. Okay? That's probably the reason why the Canadian colonies were not parties on the Declaration of Independence, even though they were still colonies in America. And I'm not a history buff, so I don't know if they had representatives at the writing of the Declaration of Independence. I would think that they may have at some point and then said, no, that's too much for me, and got out. But if you read the Articles of Confederation, it says that for those Canadian colonies to become members of the United States, all they had to do was ask to be a member. And without question, they would have been admitted immediately. So only the states that agreed to the Declaration of Independence were parties to the Declaration of Independence. So they didn't have any way to make collective decisions. None. That's why it was a general Congress, because they didn't have any way to make collective decisions. So what was the Articles of Confederation? The Articles of Confederation formed a legislative assembly of the states as the Union. And what is that? Well, they had to come up with an agreement, a participation versus compliance agreement that established the benefits, privileges, rights of participation in decision making, and cost of membership in the union that resulted from their agreement. And the rights of participation in decision making was chosen to be a legislative assembly. What kind of legislative assembly? A democracy, where all the states were assembled as equals with equal suffrage to reach a majority consensus of all the states as the Union. And they set the quorum requirement of how many states had to participate to define the agreement that they were trying to make. 9 of 13 states had to assemble in that Congress at all times in order to discuss, put a question. That means to raise a question and deliberate that question. It takes 9 of 13 states. Okay? And then when it came time to determine the question, each state had one vote. And a majority of all the states was necessary to the choice. And at that time, it was 9 of 13 states. For just about everything except for little administrative type of things that could be decided by a simple majority. But for any action that the states took together as the Union had to have a majority consensus of 9 of 13 states. Okay? This did not change when they wrote the Constitution of the United States. And if we look at the separation of powers, that comes down to the Article 1 powers of the Senate and the Article 2 powers of the Senate. Because the Senate has the power of concurrence over all decisions that are made in the United States, over all laws, all treaties, all everything. How the government is assembled, everything. The Senate has the power of concurrence over all decisions. Okay? So it didn't change with the Constitution of the United States. What they did with the Constitution of the United States is they actually balanced the legislative process. because under the Articles of Confederation, which is just a straight democracy, the large states were actually minorities in that assembly. So when it came to questions of expenditures or anything that they decided that was based on a cost-benefit analysis, like setting up the post office or the size of the military or military equipment and all that other kind of stuff, any kind of decisions that they had to make, the large states, which were the most wealthy and had control over all the resources, were a minority in those decisions. So they didn't have any way to say no or to set the scope and cost of those decisions. So they formed a confederated republic, which is a Republican form of government assembled in a bicameral legislature, where the states, based on their proportion of the population, are assembled in the House, and the House has the power to determine the scope and cost of and the cost-benefit relationship for all decisions that are made. And once they determine what the scope and cost that they want is, they transmit that decision to the Senate for concurrence. And the Senate is still a democracy, which favors the small states over the large states for concurrence. And you need the majority of all the states to concur with the decision that was made in the House. Okay? So how does that work today? We have 9 states, the 9 largest states in the United States today can determine any matter, the scope, cost, or anything of any matter that they make a decision on in the House through their proportional suffrage in the House. But when those matters are transmitted to the Senate, there are 41 smaller states that can reject that matter and return it to the Senate, return it to the House for reconsideration, along with amendments to advise those 9 states in the House what would be necessary to gain the concurrence of those 41 smaller states in the Senate. And that iterative process continues until that measure can receive a majority consensus of both chambers of Congress. That's in a bicameral legislature. That's how a bicameral legislature works. So what's the whole idea behind the tie-breaking vote for the vice president and the president's veto, which are both actually the same thing? If a matter only gets a simple majority out of the House and ends up as a tie in the Senate between all the states, that would mean 25 and 25 states, 25 for it, 25 against it. Then it's the responsibility of the president of the Senate to review that piece of legislation and determine why it was only a 50-50 vote. And that's very important because the states still have the right to petition for redress of their grievances. So if they pass a law that only passes with 50-50, a tie, and the vice president breaking the tie with a tie-breaking vote in the assent, then it would almost immediately go to the Supreme Court to resolve the matter because they have because it some way disenfranchises or disproportionately affects one or more states. Okay, and they have to, and so the Supreme Court then would be the one to have to decide whether or not that law can be implemented. Okay, and before it gets that far, it goes to the president if the vice president does. Because a no vote by the vice president will return it to the House for reconsideration, so that they can get a higher majority consensus in the Senate for passage. But once it goes to it gets past the Senate and goes to the president, it's the president's responsibility to review that legislation to understand, especially if it was a close vote in the Senate for passage, if there's anything that's actually wrong with it. Okay, what are the defects in the bill? That's what the president is supposed to be trying to understand, or it might be impossible to implement. And if he vetoes it, those are the justifications that must accompany the veto to have it reconsidered. Either the defects in the bill because it's not addressing the issue the way that, is in a way that's it may be in a way that's disproportionate, or it might not be able to be implemented, or 9 yards worth of reasons why it can't be implemented properly. And then he sends that back to the states in Congress to reconsider the bill. Okay? But all this time, it's the Senate where the states are assembled as equals with equal suffrage, the democracy that is concurring with these matters. Okay, that's the big dog. Is the Senate. Okay, so that's the Article 1 power of the Senate, is that power of concurrence over all laws that are made, so that disproportionate and laws that disenfranchise and stuff like that can't be made, because the states in the Senate will just say no and send it back to the House for reconsideration. Okay, that's the Article 1 power of the Senate. They have concurrence over all laws. The Article 2 power of the Senate is how the states act as the union. When they make those decisions of a free and independent state, how they decide to levy war or conclude peace or contract alliances or establish commerce with foreign nations or any other acts or things that a free and independent state may by right do. That's what the Senate assembled as a democracy in a unicameral legislature determines. And if you look at the Constitution, you realize that in order to act as the Union, they need 2/3 of the states to concur to act as the Union. They cannot act as the Union with less than a 2/3 majority of the states. That means that when it says, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur, that's 2/3 of the states. Why? Because the states have equal suffrage in the Senate, not their individual senators. Okay? Not their individual senators. So, when they make those decisions to act, president doesn't have anything to do with it. Vice president doesn't have anything to do with it either. And there can never be a tie in the unicameral Senate for how to act as the Union. And by and with means even for the president to even talk to a foreign nation on any subject, that it needs the consent of the Senate. Even for something that you might think is very trivial, like calling up a foreign leader or whatever you want to call them to congratulate them on their election. No, even that would require consent of the states as the Union, because I'm sorry, the states as the Union might not want to offer him any congratulations. And they have to act as a union. The president is only the messenger. He is not the decision maker. The decision maker is the states assembled as a union in the Senate. That's where it is. So that's how they establish separation of powers. Now, if we talk about secrecy and dispatch, that's how the information is transmitted between the president and the Senate, the states in the Senate, for the states to consider and determine their choice, and then tell the president what they want to do. See, we're back in these actions again. Okay? And secrecy means that, I'm sorry, but the president only presides over the executive departments. The president does not participate in any of those functions of any of the executive departments. In fact, the most the president is allowed to do is to require of the principal officer of each executive department to an opinion in writing as to the subjects and duties of their respective offices. Okay, and an opinion is not the details, and so the president can't even view any sensitive documents or anything, or even talk to a foreign nation, or like when Trump talked to Kim Jong-il, whatever his name is, or Putin, or anybody. No, that's borderline treason. that can actually be considered as treason. If the president, through that type of insubordination to the power of the states as the union, not to get their advice and consent first, before he goes off and makes meetings and talks and all this kind of, no. It was agreed by the states in the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of the United States that the states as the union would make those decisions. Not even individual states can. And that includes their citizens, because each state is responsible for their citizens who live in their state. Okay? They cannot, individual citizens can't do anything, especially even talk. I remember Dennis Rodman going over to North Korea or something. No! Not without the advice and consent of the states as the union, assembled in the Senate. That's where our democracy is. That's the established government authority. It's the states assembled in the Senate as a democracy. Okay? And then what about secrecy? How do those secrets become declassified? Well, the Senate is required to keep a journal of its proceedings. And then they decide what parts of that journal can be published. Okay, because some things cannot be published that are part of their proceedings in the decisions that they make. And they are the ones who decide what will and what will not be constituted as a secret and be published. Okay? And is it the problem? The thing people don't understand is all the states as the union in the Senate. That's why it's only 100 members in the Senate, is because they kept the number small so that very few, even the members in the House do not have access to those secret documents and other things that the states do as the union. And when you go back to the states themselves, each state has to have a Senate themselves, which keeps the information secret in a small group. Okay? So that's how they establish continuity, secrecy and dispatch. Okay? Only the Senate, that small group of senators, versus the popular branch, are the only ones who know all the secrets and make all the decisions in this country. Okay? And then continuity and stability of government was done through each state having 2 senators and the term length of the senators and offset election of the senators. And in that way, no state changes their Senate representation in the same, of both of their senators in the same election. So what the Senate was yesterday, the Senate will be tomorrow. Okay? That's the way the Senate works. Okay? That's why they have the offset elections. So that the states are stable. So that, they're only replacing one every 6 years of their 2 senators. Okay? So that's how they did continuity and stability of government. because all the decisions that they make yesterday will still be the same today and will still be the same tomorrow, which goes right into the administration of government, which is also the responsibility of the Senate. Okay? The Senate establishes all other departments of our government in the executive and judicial department to manage the general affairs of our government under the states as they're assembled in the Senate direction. Okay? So, once they make a decision, they establish it. So they assemble the whole thing, 100%. Who's going to be there and everything to do the job. If there are different departments in a specific executive department, the states in the Senate have to establish those separate departments under. Okay? And all the principal officers are appointed by the states as they're assembled in the Senate through their advice and consent. Okay? Which means the states decide who is in those executive departments and who the principal officer is, not the president. The states. Okay? And if there's a vacancy that occurs in the principal officer, then the president is required to nominate a number of nominees with the required qualifications set by who? By the states as they're assembled in the Senate through their advice. They say, we want 3 or 5 nominees with the following qualifications for us to consider to determine our choice by vote. 1 vote per state, and a majority of all the states is necessary to the choice. And notice I said a majority of the states is necessary to the choice, which means that no principal officer or even the president can be determined by vote if it's a tie. And the vice president doesn't get a vote if it's a tie, because a majority of all the states is necessary to the choice. That means that if it's only a tie, that's not a majority. So the vice president doesn't get a vote to break a tie, because that's not the requirement. The requirement is a majority of all the states. Okay? So when there's a vacancy that occurs, which is different from assembling the administration, it takes a majority consensus of the states as the union to determine the person that's going to be appointed to that position. All the president does is give the news. Okay? And the same is true for the Supreme Court. I'll talk about the Supreme Court in another video, but no, the president has no influence over who becomes a member of the Supreme Court. So, can the president, how long do those principal officers term. When does it begin? When does it end? And who decides? You know, if we're going to do a cabinet, okay, which the president doesn't have a cabinet either because he doesn't make any decisions. Well, the president, those principal officers, they don't serve the president or in the president's administration. Those principal officers were appointed by the states as they are assembled in the Senate. And only the states assembled in the House can impeach any person. For the states in the Senate to consider that impeachment and determine whether or not to remove that person permanently through conviction for the impeachment. Okay? And misdemeanor is spitting on the sidewalk. So, and insubordination is a high crime. Okay? Because insubordination can be considered treason. Okay? So, no. The president can't remove those principal officers. The most the president can do, a new president can do, is transmit information to the Senate about a principal officer that they believe is guilty of malfeasance or treason or something like that for their consideration. And if it rises to an impeachable offense, then the states in the House impeach them, and the states in the Senate convict them and permanently remove them from office. Now remember, they're removed from office on impeachment 4. So as soon as the states in the House decides that it has raised to the level of an impeachable offense, then that person is immediately removed, albeit temporarily, while the states in the Senate consider the impeachment to determine whether to convict them, and upon conviction, whether to remand them over to the criminal court system to face criminal prosecution and criminal penalties. Okay. Now, if it's just that they don't like you, then they'll just send the president home. They don't even have to say that he can never hold office under the United States anymore, just because they don't like him. Okay. Even though they could, because they have the power to do that, as long as what? As long as they make the decision together, collectively, as the union, by the required majority consensus for assent. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about democracy. And democracy is fundamentally the equality of participation in decision making with equal suffrage to determine choices and decisions. That's democracy. What's being governed? Collective decision making is being governed. The states aren't being governed. The people of the states aren't being governed. The collective decision making of the states as a union is what is being governed. And what is the governor? The legislative processes that the states agreed to in that participation versus compliance agreement to determine what constitutes an agreement between the states. That means it has to have a certain amount of, it has to be done with a quorum to come to an agreement. And then it takes the concurrence of the states in the Senate. And that's the same reason why the amendment process is made the way it is. It takes 2/3 of the states to assemble to just agree to what amendment they want to make, to discuss it, so that they all are participating in that agreement. And then that agreement has to have 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify it before it's adopted as an amendment. Okay? We're not doing that at all. And the reason why it's written the way it is, that it has to have 2/3 of the states in the House and 2/3 of the states in the Senate. And then the next thing says 2/3 of the states legislatures can decide to assemble without the House and the Senate, because if the states as proportionally, because it only takes, I think it might take less than, it might only take like 15 states to reach a 2/3 majority of the states. It might be, it's still not a lot of states, not a majority of the states. It's a majority of the states proportionally. So if those 9 largest states decided they didn't want to do it, so they kept blocking it, even though a majority, 2/3 of the states wanted to do it, then the states just say, the small states just say, screw you, to the large states, and they go and form a Congress. As long as 2/3 of the states, which is 34 states, have to assemble, and they can discuss that amendment and agree to it, what they want, and then they need 3/4 of the state legislatures to adopt the amendment. Okay, it's still those 9 largest states could still block it by not ratifying it, but they can't block it from being considered. And that's why the Fifth Amendment is written that way. But what I'm trying to impress is that the states as the union, a democracy of the states, as equals with equal suffrage, is the predominant governing institution in it is the government, okay? Because they assemble the administration of departments that they decide they need to manage the general affairs of the United States. And the president can't do anything when he comes into office except for talk to those the principal officers to understand the subjects and duties of their office. Period. He doesn't get to fire anybody, and he can't have anybody in the White House that hasn't been established by the states in the Senate and agreed to appoint in the White House in any capacity by majority consensus by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. And yes, there are some lower, inferior officers that these states in the Senate can decide that the principal officers and the president can select themselves. But the states in the Senate will tell the president what those officers are. if the president doesn't decide that, and like I said, the president and those officers are not independent. They talk about the immigration and stuff, and all these other officers, Justice Department and all that other kind of crap. No, those officers are directed by the states as they're assembled in the Senate. They are not independent on their own. They're not in. They can't make any decisions about what to do. None. They're told what to do and when to do it. It's their responsibility to do what they are told to do. So talking about the Justice Department and Merrick Garland or whatever needs to have a special prosecutor. No, only the states as the Senate can determine what those departments do. Because that's how the Senate manages how the states act as the union and to administer the government. Okay? Act as a union. The House is the Republican form of government. They deal with other things like taxes, expenditures, projects, that the interstate projects, and the mail and telephone, telegraph, or whatever. That's what the House does. Those decisions are only about the union and the benefits and privileges of the states in the union, which forms the union and maintains the union. But when it comes to how the states act as a union, no. That's the power of the Senate as a unicameral legislature. Okay? Article 2 and 3. Yeah, because all petitions for redress of grievances have to be made in Congress. And then Congress assembles a court to adjudicate that matter. And they have a way to do it. Okay? The Supreme Court is just a pool of judges that can be selected, one from each state. A pool of judges when a petition is filed. And the Chief Justice only presides over those proceedings to make sure that the Supreme Court functions properly to reach a majority for a decision. But when it comes down to it, there's only 5 judges that will hear and decide any matter. 5. And they're chosen by lot, from a pool of judges, one from each state, to hear and decide the matter. Okay? So when we get down to it, the Senate is the United States and the United States government. They're responsible for every aspect of the United States government. Okay? How it makes decisions, what those different departments do, who we talk to, who we have alliances with, who we have treaties with, who we even talk to and who we don't talk to. Even if we give money or something like that. and they don't have to go through the House to appropriate money for those things, because they're doing it by a 2/3 majority of the states in the Senate, which is higher majority than the 50%. So we can't even talk to Ukraine because we don't have a treaty. We got to have a treaty first. And that treaty has to be made by and with the advice and consent of the states in the Senate. Okay? We can't even talk to Israel. Give them money or anything, support, weapons, nothing. Without a treaty that's made by and with the advice and consent of the states in the Senate. I don't care what. We are violating the Constitution by giving them any money, any weapons, advice, or anything without a treaty. Because all treaties, just like the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation before it, is a participation versus compliance agreement. And we have to discuss what those benefits and privileges are and how we're going to make decisions of that together as in an alliance. And then the cost. We have to discuss the cost that we are expected and what the benefit of what we're paying them is going to be. So it's just not a decision of we think their cause is very nice and we're going to give them a bunch of money. No. We have to have the advice and consent of all the states. 2/3 of the states have to assent to anything. That's 34 states have to agree to give any kind of aid or even discuss the matter with those people. Okay? This is why the Senate is so important. And can it be a politically assembled body by political parties winning seats? No. Every state has equal suffrage in the Senate. Not parties. Parties don't have any suffrage. They're not assembled in the Senate by party. So there can't be a majority leader. The person of authority in the Senate is the president of the Senate. There ain't nobody else. There's no majority leaders, minority leaders, or any of that crap. And whose responsibility is it to make sure that our government is properly assembled and properly functions? Well, that's the president of the Senate again. That is the only responsibility they have, is to make sure our government is properly assembled and that it functions properly as a democracy where the states are assembled as equals with equal suffrage to reach a majority consensus. That's the only job that the vice president has, and to preside over the proceedings of that body, to make sure that it functions properly. That's what they're there for, to make sure that they are participating as equals in the proceedings to make decisions. That's what they're there for. Okay? That's the most important government official we have, is that person who makes sure that it functions properly, that it's assembled properly and it functions properly. That's their job. And they have the power to take any actions that they deem necessary in their opinion to correct any misassembly or problems with how it functions, including raising the entire thing, which is what's necessary today, because it's not assembled right at all, and it doesn't function right at all. Okay? It's a collective governing system. The states have to be assembled as equals with equal suffrage and must have the equality of participation in making those decisions of a free and independent state with the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do, that's an action, all other acts and things that an independent state may by right do. Okay? That's why the Senate is the most important governing institution we have today. My next video, I'll tell you why the House is the most important assembly we have today. Thank you.